Baldur's Gate 3 is surprisingly popular right now, and I guess that's what happens when you release a game without a battle pass or day one DLC or requiring somebody to sell their left kidney to pay for the damn thing. I've been playing it and I've been enjoying it, but I've been playing it on not quite top spec hardware, 4070 Ti, recent processor, 32 gigs of RAM, and I'm having a great time with it. But the minimum recommended system hardware requirements for this game are something in the order of a GTX 970 and an i5 4690, which both of which are about 10 years old by now. So let's try it out on 10-year-old hardware. Now, I've got my trusty GTX 970, and I was going to use my i3 12100F in this comparison, but as of writing this, I'm realizing now how utterly pointless that would be. The i5 4690 is a lever action compared to the i3 that is a slimmer, faster AR-15. The i3 is powerful for its day, but it's just outclassed by newer hardware. Now, to put this into perspective, the i3 is roughly 70% faster in single core performance, and it has hyper-threading, all while consuming half the power under load, and that's as close in CPU performance as I'd be able to get. So we're just gonna, it's just pointless. So I'm just gonna test it with my i5, my system. We're just gonna swap out the GPU, and that should be good enough for a graphics comparison. So all that being said, how does the 970 perform in Baldur's Gate 3? Now, throwing this thing in my rig makes the 4070 Ti just feel like an absolute monster. I can't believe this is how our rigs used to look. But using the game's default settings, or I should say the auto-detected settings for the game, at 1080p, you'll push the card up to the game's default Ultra preset, and depending on where you are in the world, you'll average either 25 FPS or 50 FPS. There's no real in between there, and it honestly depends on how much VRAM you're using. The GTX 970 might have been advertised as a 4 gig card, but it does not in fact have the full 4 gigs of usable VRAM usable at the full graphics card bandwidth. Only 3.5 gigs are usable at the full bandwidth. So in areas of the game where you're using less than 3.5 gigs of VRAM, you're going to have a very stable experience. So the game options like texture settings and stuff that will adjust the amount of VRAM you're using are the ones you're going to want to adjust if you're using a 970 or a lower VRAM card to have the biggest impact on your frame rate. Because what's happening is as the card needs to use more VRAM, it's getting more VRAM, but the remaining half a gig of VRAM is just so much slower that it's bogging down the card, it's not letting it stretch its legs fully, and it's cutting your frame rate in half. With VRAM being the biggest limiting factor with the GTX 970, let's try a GTX 1070. It's got 8 gigs of faster VRAM, so let's give it a shot. And with the 1070 in the system, the game again defaults to the Ultra settings again, except this time we're able to use more VRAM. So our average frame rate is about 80 FPS anywhere in the world, and that's on Ultra at 1080p. You can push this up to about 1440p at the same settings and get about 50 to 60 FPS. And that's because the game, when you're at Ultra 1080p, the game wants to use about 5.5 or 6 gigs of VRAM, which the 1070 can supply. The 970 can't really supply that very well, so it tries to compress the game to fit it into the VRAM, and then it needs to use the additional VRAM that it just can't really use. So if the GTX 970 had adequate VRAM at Ultra 1080p, you'd probably get about 50 to 60 FPS because you're letting the card fully unlock the die of the GPU, and that's just something you can't do with that card. But at 1080p, GTX 970, just medium or low settings, you're going to have an okay time. But that is why it's super important when you're picking a video card, you have to ask yourself how long you plan on keeping the card. If you plan on keeping your video card for a console generation or more, make sure to get a card with more VRAM than you think you need. That probably means going with AMD instead of NVIDIA. And I like NVIDIA cards. They're good cards, and I have NVIDIA cards. But NVIDIA as a company would rather intentionally handicap their cards to shorten their usable lifespan so that you upgrade more frequently and spend more of your hard-earned money on their products, as opposed to getting a good product that's going to last a very long time. But anyway, that's my rant over. That's all I have for this week. I hope you enjoyed today's video, found it useful, found it helpful. Subscribe to the channel if you want to see more, do all that cool stuff. See you guys in the next one.